Hi everyone, we're nearing the end with the Renaissance. The term Renaissance means rebirth or revival, and it has a lot to do with a renewal of the arts, sciences, literature, architecture during the early modern era. And when we refer to the early modern era, we're typically talking about the years between about 1300 and 1600 AD. And the Renaissance will really originate in the Italian city-states for several reasons we'll discuss here in a moment, but a lot of it will have to do with some of the demographic trends that we've talked about in previous lectures. Lots of people moving to cities, and increasingly lots of artists and writers and thinkers moving to some of these Italian city-states. All right, and while I'm using the phrase Italian city-states, we need to understand that there was no unified country of Italy during this time period. Instead, as you can see from the map here, you have sort of a patchwork quilt of various city-states, not only an urban core such as the city itself of Florence, but you'll notice that the Republic of Florence encompassed a much larger area. Agricultural lands, other smaller villages, what have you. So politically speaking, these are independent principalities, and sometimes they're getting along, sometimes they're not. We've heard this before with regard to city-states. So when we think about why the Renaissance, this stirring of learning in the arts and sciences, why it begins here, some of it has to do with history. Think about it. These are individuals who were living in the shadow of Roman ruins. We've talked about the once mighty Roman Empire. These peoples in this region just simply always have sort of a longer view of history. They understand the culture that gave birth to them, and in many respects valued that and treasured it over the years. When we also look to the Italian city-states as the home of this first revival of learning in Western Europe, we also think about the fact of geography. Look at all these port cities, from Naples to Venice to Genoa, and of course Rome. When we think about the Crusades, several lectures ago we talked about hundreds of thousands of individuals leaving from Western Europe to make their way to the Muslim-controlled Holy Lands. Many of them will stop over here in the Italian city-states. They will then board ships to make their final leg of the journey across the Mediterranean. When they do this, when you have almost 200 years worth of all these visitors pouring into the Italian city-states, you have people dropping a lot of money there. These crusaders are coming into Genoa, Pisa, Rome, what have you, and when they get there, they need a suit of armor to purchase. They need supplies, they need a horse, they need to get their broken weapons fixed, what have you. So you're going to see the rise of a very wealthy merchant class in these Italian city-states. And as these individuals over several generations build up their businesses, servicing these travelers coming through their hometown, they're going to look for ways to spend their money. Some of them will spend their money in politics. Some of these wealthy businessmen will decide to kind of dip their toe into overseas exploration through trading companies, through joint stock corporations. And then finally, with regards to our discussion, you're going to have some of these very wealthy individuals who simply want to spend money on things that bring them amusement. So they're hiring architects, for instance, to come in and build fancier homes for themselves and their families to enjoy. They're hiring painters to come in and they're commissioning portraits of themselves, or they want something beautiful to look at on their walls. So they might hire a fresco artist to paint the ceiling of their bedroom. They might hire musicians to come in and perform at the wedding of their children. All right, so a lot of money now is going to be spent by these very wealthy Italian businessmen, and now that there's a demand for artists and writers and poets, what have you, these people are going to start flocking to these cities looking for paid employment. And this, therefore, is the concept of patronage. This is someone who has the money and is willing to spend it on the work of individuals who are talented in certain areas in which they are not. Musicians, thinkers, writers, what have you. And when we look at the importance of patronage, we certainly look at this as something that will catapult the artistic expertise of many of these painters and sculptors and architects of the period. And here's the deal. You now have all these prospective artists flocking to these Italian city-states, each one looking for employment. Now that they have full-time paid employment doing what they love, whereas before they may have had to do it only part-time and then work another part-time job, their skill level is going to start shooting through the roof. All right. For anyone who's played a musical instrument, you know the only way you get better at it is practice, 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 much to the irritation of everyone within earshot of you. All right, but you understand that. So the same is true for poets or, not only musicians, but sculptors or architects. Now that they have so many people willing to pay them to do what they love, to practice their art 100% of the time, their skill level is just going to get phenomenally better. Not only that, but as you have groups of artists flocking to these cities, you now have an artistic community of individuals who can share tips and techniques. And so again, this will help to boost the skill level of these writers and artists and creators during the Renaissance. So that's why we end up seeing this kind of explosion of creativity during this period. And when we think about the types of patronage in the Italian city-states, we refer to these private businessmen in many cases, individuals or wealthy families. We also refer to civic patronage, which means that you might have individual guilds. You might also have individual cities. The city of Florence, for instance, spent quite a bit of taxpayer money hiring artists and architects to come in and beautify these cityscapes for the benefit of the citizens. And then finally, you'll have church patronage. The Roman Catholic Church will also decide to hire many writers and artists during this period. And I want to say one more thing about a change in the type of art that you see during the Renaissance. During the Middle Ages, the major patron of the arts was the Roman Catholic Church. So when you have an artist hired to create a fresco or a painting, a triptych, whatever, it's going to be very strictly limited what the subject matter can be. If the church is paying your bills, then the subject of your painting or whatever sculpture will have to be religious in nature. So almost universally during the Middle Ages, we see religious-themed art. Not so during the Renaissance. Now you have private patrons who say, you know what? That's fine. I might want a religious painting to hang, in my dining room, but I want something different in my bedroom, or I want something different on the ceiling of my great room. So you're going to start to see a shift from strictly religious-themed art during the Middle Ages to now artists during the Renaissance have the ability to kind of branch out, and many of them will start to revisit classical themes on canvas or in stone through sculpture. So, for example, you see I've got a painting here of Venus and Adonis, people reaching all the way back to the Roman classical world of mythology and showcasing some of these themes on canvas. Or you'll see secular portraiture. You can see the portrait of a gentleman here by Bartolomeo Veneto. This is not a religious figure. This is just a wealthy businessman who said, you know what, I want a picture of me hanging on my wall for generations afterwards to admire the man who, really sort of built up this family from what it was. Of course, you will still see religious-themed art. Certainly anything that's commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church, and we talked about church patronage a minute ago, anything commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church will have to be religious in nature. But you'll also see through civic patronage, individual cities or guilds. For example, you see a picture of the Bankers Guild in Florence, how they commissioned sculpture and architects to come in and beautify their meeting hall there. You will see non-religious themes being used from time to time as well. And to help underline the importance, in particular, of private patronage, that in which you have an individual or you have a family that they're hiring poets and musicians and architects and the like. Perhaps one of the biggest patrons of the arts was the de Medici family that lived in Florence. Their money came from working in the banking industry over many generations. And by the time Lorenzo de Medici came to the head of this family, he and his family had already dropped quite a bit of money on hiring a number of sculptors and painters during this period. In fact, one member of the de Medici family over time estimated that his family probably spent over 660,000 florins on hiring artists and architects and sculptors over time. A florin was the unit of currency in the city of Florence. It was simply a gold coin. And to give you an idea of how much money was thrown around by this one family just on beautification projects, at this time the average worker in the city of Florence made only 20 of these gold coins a year, gold florins, or a university professor made only 100 florins a year. This one family dropped more than 660,000 gold florins on hiring some of the most famous artists of the day. For example, the family underwrote artists such as Donatello, Fra Angelico, Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and while in his youth, a man by the name of Michelangelo, who actually lived with the de Medici family for several years and dined at their table. So Lorenzo is someone who's growing up in a family that appreciates the support for the arts. He himself is not only a businessman, but will become a scholar and a poet in his own right. He will study the works of many different writers and artists. And if you've heard the term a Renaissance man, Lorenzo de Medici is a very good example of a so-called Renaissance man. We use that term to mean someone who is proficient in a number of different areas. Someone who will kind of take it upon themselves to self-study across a bunch of different fields. And so they become experts in a lot of different areas. They're a very well-rounded individual. And what's also interesting about the Renaissance is you'll see a resurgence in the concept of humanism, a philosophy that really emphasizes celebrating humankind's achievements over the age. We haven't seen a focus on humanism in quite some time. And by quite some time, I mean actually the ancient Greeks and the Romans. You're having to stretch back more than 1,000 years to see this philosophy really in action with the Greeks and the Romans. Now we see a revival of humanism. And we see Renaissance scholars in desperate need of kind of information on humanism, information on philosophy, these sorts of things that have languished, that have not really grown during the Middle Ages. They are reaching back as well over more than 1,000 years, and they're pulling out these old dusty manuscripts from the Greek and Roman eras, and they're dusting them off, they're translating them, they're encoding this information for future generations, and they are really saying, wow, this stuff is awesome. How have we forgotten about it for more than 1,000 years? And when we talk about probably the foremost humanist scholar of the early Renaissance, the man that is often credited as being sort of the father of Renaissance humanism, we refer to the Italian writer and poet Petrarch. Petrarch, who will have not only an education in reading and writing in his native language of Italian, but will also learn how to read and write in Latin. And for this reason, he's one of those that have found some of these old manuscripts, especially from the Roman world, and he's seeing that they're crumbling to pieces. He's pulling them out, and he's saying, you know, we have to translate these now into a language that more people can read it in. No one speaks Latin now except for the Roman Catholic Church. And so he will translate a number of works from the Roman writer and philosopher Cicero. And in doing so, he will make Cicero's words that have been forgotten for, more than a millennium, he will make them now available to more people. We also remember Petrarch for writing vernacular Italian poetry. Vernacular Italian is just, what once had been Latin now has kind of morphed into what we think of as the modern day language of Italian. And so he is also a poet in his own right, in addition to being a scholar who very much venerates the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans.